Hi, I'm Jennifer Valtos.
And I'm Michael Carlin, and we're with the Center for Compassion, Integrity, and Secular Ethics at Life University. And this video is part of the Facilitator Training Program for the Compassionate Integrity Training Program. This video is going to help you understand how to click through the presentation and to facilitate skill number 5, which is impartiality and common humanity. It's the first skill that we'll be talking about that's in our Series 2, which is relating to others. And as always, if you click, all 3 of those series will build onto the screen. Again, this is a good time to try to connect all the pieces together and perhaps even asking why we might start with impartiality and common humanity at this point when we're talking about relating to others as just a good conversation starter. Obviously, it'll become clear, hopefully, by the end of the presentation and session why we're doing this, but good to get a baseline and see what people are thinking. Again, when you click to the next slide, you'll see the skill for today highlighted, and finally, you'll do your check-in at this point where you ask everyone to check in on whether they've been using any of the skills in the past week or 2 weeks since the last time you had a session together, and whether they've done any of the formal practices and if there's any issues that they're having with those so that you can help guide them through that. When you click to the next slide, we get into the first activity, and Jennifer's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Michael. So you're going to move into your first group activity, which is Hi, Who Are You? It's a great activity. It really provides the participants with the opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better because they're going to be working with multiple partners. But it can be kind of confusing when you're explaining it to them. Even though you're doing a great job of explaining it, the concept could be a little bit challenging. So you and your co-facilitator may need to give an example of what the activity looks like before you separate your group and let them go and start the activity. And then once you've had an opportunity to complete the activity, you'll bring everybody back and you'll process that as a large group. And then once you've had the opportunity to do that, you'll start with the presentation information. And you'll go into the next slide, which will come up and you'll see the word bias at the top. You've got your little black chicks and you've got your little yellow chick. And really getting the participants to have an understanding of what bias is and how what their definition of it is and how that impacts the skill we're going to be talking about, which is impartiality and common humanity. It is important, and when you click on it, the bullet points will come up, so you continue to click on the slide. It is important for the participants to understand that creating categories and categorizing individuals is natural. People do it all the time. And part of that is our historical perspective. We needed to be able to do that in order to be able to survive. I needed to be able to look at something and go, okay, I've eaten that before, that red fruit on that tree, I've eaten that before, and it was great, it was very tasty, and that's wonderful, so I can categorize that. Or, no, that plant there on the ground is, somebody ate that in my group, and they died, and so we don't want that. We don't want to eat that. We want to stay away from that. So creating those categories is really important for individuals, and historically we have a need to do that. The problem is that when it becomes an absolute, and we are not willing to move from that bias. So categorizing individuals and information is sometimes necessary, but we don't want to make the mistake that it is an absolute, that can't change in any way, shape, or form. So then when we click to the next slide, we potentially move from categorizing things to categorizing people. And that can be relatively harmless. My partner is a Florida fan, so I will root for Florida State just to heckle that individual. And that's fine because that's harmless. It's in good fun. You know, we bet over who has to cook dinner depending on who wins that game. But it's harmless, and we're not hurting anybody other than each other's pride when that team loses. So then we click on the next slide. And when this becomes a challenge or when this becomes problematic is when we begin to dehumanize others and dehumanize individuals. So, for example, when I use the example of the Florida versus Florida State. So if I'm now beginning to think that all Florida Gators fans are horrible individuals and they don't deserve to have good things happen to them and I'm wishing evil upon them, that's bad. So when we begin to believe that the essence of those individuals is bad is when we have challenges and we need to think differently.
Yeah, and I think this kind of categorization that you're talking about, we can easily see how it's at the core of racism, of sexism, of ageism. You know, basically any of the isms comes down when we begin to kind of confuse the kind of superficial and evolutionarily adaptive nature of categorization with essences, with really that these people are all this way and that's what defines them. And we start to categorize those things into not just superficial and useful categories, but absolutes of good and evil. And we can do that in a way that is conscious. So we have people who actually will say, you know, I'm conscious of this bias. And your football example on a lighter note is a way of saying, you know I'm a Georgia fan, and I don't like those Gator fans because I want to root against them. But again, that can be kind of lighthearted and superficial, and I'm conscious of that potential bias. It can also become, there's the explicit bias like that, but there's also, as we click onto the next slide, there's also what's called implicit bias. And this is going to be a little bit different the way you're going to explain this to people, because the explicit bias is going to be handled in one way, whereas the implicit bias is something that may be even more difficult to handle, because this is biases that we have that we're not even aware of. And you're going to explain to them something called the implicit association test. And this is a test that's come under a little bit of fire recently because some of the authors and others that have used the test maybe are overgeneralizing some of the results of this test. But in any case, it's still a good way of explaining what implicit bias is. So we leave it in for the time being. But as you can see from this particular presentation or this particular slide, is that you see implicit bias with things like race, religion, age, and they have ways of testing it for all sorts of different categories. It could be gender, political party, ethnicity, any kinds of superficial categories that can be created can be used as a way of biasing against others. And again, this is in an implicit way. So one of the things we'll do here is just quickly show how this test works, so it's helpful to explain to people what implicit bias is. So if you click to the next slide, you'll see an image of what the implicit association test looks like. And here you'll see that there's an image in the middle, and that will be dependent upon the kinds of things that you're testing for. And so here you see that this is going to be a test for African Americans and European Americans and one's association or implicit association with those different categories. And so then there's also going to be good words and bad words that will appear, and as the test proceeds, you'll be asked to associate unconsciously in a way, the way the test is run, but you'll be associating good words with one of those categories and bad words with one of those categories. If you click again, it'll show you kind of the wide variety of different categories that they have tested and that can be tested, and the list can actually be endless. But if you clicked it once, you'll get to this page, but if you click it again, it'll actually scroll automatically for you, and you'll see all of the different categories, and you can point out some of the different categories that they've done research around. If you click it again, we give two different examples of different IATs. And so this one here, as you can see, is a bias for old people versus young people. And it gives you this is what the test would look like for somebody before they actually started it. And they tell you what the good words are going to be, what the bad words are going to be, and what the images will look like. So you can see that and know what's coming, which kind of can get rid of some of the other kinds of testing biases that exist. And so this is just one example that you can share. Another example that we share here is images and words associated with different religions, in this case Judaism and Christianity. And so the test would proceed from there using these words or images and testing how rapidly somebody is clicking on buttons on their keyboard in order to try to measure the kinds of implicit associations people have with good words, bad words, and particular categories, whether it's religion or race or age, things of that nature. So there's been a lot of testing that's been going on in that area, and this is just some examples of it. That's one way that people have tried to get at this implicit bias. If you click again, you'll see another example, and this is done through Yale. This is a study that was done that was testing where school teachers were looking in their classroom. And so this was a situation where teachers were reporting that certain groups of kids were getting in trouble more often than others, and the claim is that those kids misbehave more often, and that's why they get in trouble more. And then after they got that data, they went ahead and started using cameras to measure where the teacher's eyes were looking in the class and correlating where those eyes were looking with the kinds of children that they were looking at. And as you can see from this image, you see that they spent 42% of the time looking at black boys and then 34% of the time looking at white boys versus the black or white girls. So here you might see some race bias. You might also see some gender bias. And so at the end of the day, part of the question that comes up from this is, are these children getting in more trouble because they're misbehaving more or because they're being watched more? And is that maybe implicit bias towards watching those children more ending up causing them to get in trouble more? So it's a really intriguing way of trying to get at how implicit bias can also affect our behavior, who we look at, how we surveil people, and what our implicit associations are with those different categories of people. So there's some interesting research underway, both in terms of the implicit association test and other kinds of studies being done like this one at Yale, that's trying to get at this kind of underlying unconscious bias that informs the way that we look at people, the way we categorize people, the way we make assumptions about people. And although this research is continuing to grow and in some cases is being critiqued, and for good reason in some cases, it's also something that we can just know in ourselves, that when we see people, when we just look at somebody, what are the first things that come into our mind? What are the kinds of knee-jerk reactions that we have to those people? And if we actually can step back and look at that, we'll see that all sorts of biases jump to our minds right away when we see people. And those biases may be correct. In some cases, they may be. And in many cases, though, they're wrong. And if we don't interrogate those, then and really bring them to the surface, then we could be acting, behaving, speaking in ways that are informed by biases that we're not even conscious of or barely conscious of. And we'll see that more as we do some of the activities in today's session. So at this point, we would transition into the next slide, which is on reflective writing and mindful dialogue. And this will be our chance to do that. And I'm going to turn it over to Jen now, who's going to explain that and take it from here.
So as we're finishing up our reflective writing and mindful dialogues, we have then the opportunity to click to the next slide, which just has the word impartiality on it. And so asking the participants what impartiality is and why it's important and what this picture has to do with our impartiality, or what this picture has to do with impartiality, is a great opportunity to share with the participants that as we are getting ready to plant seeds for forgiveness and gratitude and compassion, we need to have a level playing field. We need to have a field that is able to take those seeds and allow them to grow uniformly. We don't want them to be planted in rocky soil where some will grow and some will not grow. We want to be able to have that field prepared so that all of our seeds of forgiveness, gratitude, and compassion will grow uniformly. So then we click on the next slide, We can think of this as the sunshine metaphor. The sun shines all the time, day and night, depending on where you are in the world. And for those individuals who are closer to the equator, the sun is going to shine more intensely. So if we think about that in our lives as we are attempting to cultivate these skills, I am attempting to cultivate impartiality and common humanity. I'm attempting to cultivate forgiveness and gratitude and compassion. And so those individuals who are closest to me are going to benefit more from that than those individuals who are further away from me. However, that doesn't mean that I am ignoring those individuals. It doesn't mean that they're not going to benefit at all. Because as I am creating I've created these seeds and I've let them grow, the individuals closest to me are going to benefit more, but I am not trying to put anybody down. I'm not trying to send other people off to the side. What I'm trying to do is bring everybody up and to provide everybody with an opportunity to benefit from that. But again, those closest to me are going to benefit more than those who are further away.
Thank you, Jen, and that's a great explanation of those two metaphors, which are kind of central to this piece. And then if you click to the next slide, we talk about what do we mean then by common humanity, because on one hand we know what the issue is. We've talked about bias, both explicit and implicit, and this need for impartiality. Well, how do you change it? How do you get to impartiality? How do you reduce our bias? And that's where we start to talk about common humanity. So common humanity, if you click once, you get this idea, this image with the words common humanity. And again, like all these slides, this is a good opportunity to open it up to people about what they think common humanity is and what we mean by common humanity. But if you click again, it's going to give our definition of this, which is just focusing on what all human beings have in common, as opposed to those differences that are always in our minds, whether implicitly or explicitly, as we categorize people. How do we categorize people differently? How do we focus on those commonalities between all of these people? And then if you click to the next slide, that leads us into our breakout group, which is really an opportunity for people to explore this in much more in depth. And so you'll break people up into 2 or 3 groups. And in order for them to do this activity, which is called the Common Humanity stories, what we do is we provide you with 5 different images. So that's the first one, second one, third, fourth, and then here's the last one. And what we typically advise, and you can read this in your facilitator guide, is that you pick 2 of these. So just go ahead and pick 2 of these. I'm going back through them. You would pick 2 of these that you would use for that activity and leave on the screen for that activity. And again, those instructions are detailed in the facilitator guide, so I won't go through that here. But when you do get everyone back together and you have an opportunity to debrief, I'm going to scroll back to where you would be. One of the things you're going to ask, as you'll see in the facilitator guide, is after people have had the opportunity to tell you what they have in common with each of these individuals, you'll then put up this image, which is a collage of all 5 of these people. And this is an opportunity to say, well, what do you have in common with all of these individuals? Again, trying to continue to get at the more and more core elements of who we are as human beings. What is it that all of these people have in common with all of the people that are in that room? And then I'm sure some very, very powerful things will come up in terms of common humanity. But then the final punchline is we click to the final slide in this activity. And that's going back to this original slide of these thousands of pictures of different kinds of people from all over the globe, and asking, what do we have in common with all of these people? And if people haven't gotten there already, we're really at the point of common humanity at this point. What we have in common with everybody. Things like we all seek happiness and we all face difficulties and want to reduce those difficulties and suffering. We're all born. We're all going to die. All of those kinds of things that unite us. We all have nervous systems. We all have emotions. We all want to belong, and we all want to be loved. So again, this is just a whole series of things that will hopefully organically come from the group, and we just resonate with this image of how we have commonality with everybody, and can we really focus in on that level. If you transition to the next slide, this is a short video called Get Service that you've probably seen when you took CIT, and is a way of really helping people see that beyond those differences that we see in people, there's always something going on below the surface that probably unites us in some way. And so that's a good video to use as a way of really kind of bringing this whole section home.
It is.
And now we transition to the next one, and Jen, you'll take it from here.
Sorry, Michael. Yeah, it is. It really is. That video it kind of helps to bring home all the things that we've been talking about. Like you said, that everybody is got something. Everybody has something going on in their minds that we don't necessarily know about. So treating everybody as you would someone you're concerned about. I like that video. So then we're going to move to cultivating impartiality. And this is really just to recap some of the things that we've talked about throughout the session, because this is a little bit longer session sometimes, and can be a little bit difficult for individuals. So just to remember what we're cultivating, how we're cultivating impartiality by examining the limitations of those categories that we started the session when we created, focusing on common humanity and recognizing the benefits of impartiality. So then we click to the next slide, which brings up friend, enemy, and stranger. And really what we're trying to get at with this slide is just helping to understand that those categories are interchangeable. They're limited. You know, sometimes you have a falling out with a friend and they become an enemy. Sometimes an enemy becomes a friend because you've bonded together over a common issue. Something happened and you become friends. Strangers become friends. Strangers become enemies. How we categorize individuals changes. And as long as we're still being aware that those categories are fluid, they're going to change. And we don't want those categories to dehumanize the individuals that we're talking about. It will help us to really understand how impartiality and common humanity are so important to all of us. And then we move into our contemplative practice. And our contemplative practice, there are several in the facilitator guide for the facilitators to choose from. One of the ones that we've been using lately is the one that's called Just Like Me. And that's a great one to really understand common humanity. But there are several in the guide for which the facilitators can choose. And then that brings us to our last slide, which wraps up and tells us that we are in Series 2, Relating to Others. This was the first skill in Series 2, which is impartiality and common humanity. And we look forward to seeing you for skill number 6, which is about forgiveness and gratitude.